and say, now why did I lump those together? Second system effect. How many of you have had the experience of working on a system where the 1.0 version has finally been released and your boss or whoever says, okay, we're going to do the next version. And suddenly there is a flood of features that come in. Anyone have some stories they want to share? Or can,
Sure, yeah. So I inherited a system that had just barely been released for BYU for reviewing general education courses and deciding whether or not they were certified to be general education or not. And about 3 months after I kind of had settled into the position, we had a meeting with the people from general education, and my boss announced that we were working on version 2.0, and this was kind of news to me. And they were like, great, we want all this and this and this and this and this in version 2.0, and it was a long and interesting process, but we ended up releasing 2.0, and so the same thing happened with 3.0 after that. So that's what we're currently working on.
And this brings up the problem. Well, it actually talks about two things. It talks about architecture. Well, yeah, I assume you read this. But the issue here that I really want to touch on is technical debt. How many of you have heard this term before? Those of you who haven't, technical debt is all the things you did that were quick and dirty and that were chewing gum and baling wire to get the thing out the door that they swore you'd be able to go back and clean up after you released. And then, instead of going back and cleaning up, they say, okay, here's the new set of features. You're saying, no, wait, we have a lot of really ugly stuff under the hood here. That's technical debt. And this is a serious issue because, again, management, and especially marketing, does not appreciate technical debt. They think if it works, it works. There's nothing wrong underneath. You know, it's a bit like building a house where underneath, instead of a concrete foundation, you basically have wood frames that are holding the house up. And it's kind of like, okay, we did this so people could move in, but now we have to wait and go back and actually put some concrete walls and pillars there. And so it's like, no, let's build a second and a third story. It's like, no, you don't understand. It's not going to work. This will end very badly. My daughter Crystal, who I may be able to get in a guest lecture towards the end of the semester, has a great story that was exactly this at her job. And this was early on, like her first year or two there. And she and a small team just did this heroic effort to basically bring up this proof of concept system. The company basically allows her, the company she works for, Solution Reach, its whole focus is creating portals to allow patients and dentists, optometrists, and I think some doctors communicate with each other so that the patient can go online, schedule an appointment, message the doctor, stuff like that. So they had this new concept, and she and a small team managed to actually launch it, but they did so unlike Microsoft SQL Server. I mean, it was a small end database, and it was intended to be sort of a proof of concept. And when they did, the management came back and said, okay, we now want to expand this to 10,000 users. And they said, no, this won't work. This will die horribly. Our back end will not support 10,000 users. And they had a long-standing battle back and forth. And in the end, as I recall, finally prevailed and got management to actually give them the time to put in a proper industrial-grade database backend. But this is the real issue. It's just this, how many of you have worked on projects where you've had issues of technical debt and management has not allowed you to go back and fix them? Anyone want to give any stories? Yes?
Yeah, when I was working on the scheduling display system in the ED, we released, well, I initially made a demo with horrible technical debt and told my boss, yeah, we'll have to fix this later. My boss said, great. And then his boss said, well, that's really nice. We can ship this now, though. So we shipped it a few months later. And I had fixed about half of the things that by then that were technical debt, but a lot of them I had either forgotten in that much time or didn't have the time for. And so 3
Start
months
showing
after,
up
yeah,
in
3
your
months
life,
after that, our screens are running out of battery because the SQL queries were inefficient because
Yeah.
that was all a hack.
Yep.
And that had to be rewritten.
Yeah, but
Oh yeah, I was gonna say I had to write a labeling system that would take a format and create images out of it. But it was literally like my first project for the company, like 3 weeks after I was on promotion, I had no idea what I was doing. So it was supposed to be a prototype.
yeah.
And then of course all prototypes ship, that's the rule. Eventually they did let me go back because it all broke
Yeah.
horribly. And so I ended up rewriting it later, but yeah.
Now, I will say that one of the things I'm most proud of professionally, Pages, remember? We're starting out, I'm building an engineering team from scratch, working with the founders to try and raise venture funding, and I'm building this prototype using Interface Builder on NextStep. And it's all it is intended to do is to demonstrate the concepts of the user interface. This is how it's going to work with word processor. And it's really ugly underneath. And it's not a real word processor or anything like that. And we're going and going and going, and we finally, it takes us 1.5 years to close on venture funding. I started in the middle of 1990, it takes us to the end of 91 to close on venture funding. We hire the last few engineers, and I delete all the prototype code, every last bit of it. And said, turning to the engineers and saying, we're starting from scratch. Because I knew exactly, if we kept it around and say, oh, well, look, you've got this and this and this working, and I knew how it was unbelievably ugly. It was smoke and mirrors behind the user interface. All just pretty much to show off the user interface. And had no serious document word processing functionality underneath, and it would be a nightmare to try and transform it to that. So we just threw it all out. Now, by that point, we already had several engineers hired. We'd all been doing some work on the interface. We all knew how things needed to work, but we were starting with a clean sheet of paper. And the code was vastly, vastly better for that. Plan to throw one away. Now this is Brooks himself. In fact, your next reading, which is I think 16, 17, it's chapters 18 and 19 where you're going to see this. But this was something controversial. This is Brooks basically anticipating in 1975 the idea of iterative development. But his comment was basically, you're going to build a system, and by the time you get it up to functionality, it's going to look ugly, so you should just throw it away and start over. I can tell you that management and marketing doesn't like this approach. And Brooks himself says iterative development pretty much sidesteps this. Instead of doing a big system and then saying, okay, this is hopelessly bad, but now we know what to do, he's saying, do small iterations, so on and so forth. But the problem is, as I said, too often pilot or prototype systems are forced to evolve into production systems. That is why at Pages we literally threw one away. But I didn't consider it. All it was for me was a demonstration software. So, some of you have addressed this already. Any other situations where you've seen a system that sort of got to a certain point and was so bad that you, in essence, had to throw it out and start over? Yeah.
I mean, I manage a lot of automation scripts for my company, and there have been times where we realized we were running in JavaScript on Google Sheets, and we realized that there was an email manager that was limiting us to 100 emails per day, and so we were trying to make so it's able to notify people with the script, and so we ended up moving that from JavaScript to Python, and suddenly I realized all of these things. I first wrote the script years ago, and it was terribly written, and I was like, I got to completely gut this thing out and make it nice. So.
Yep. Anyone? Yes.
Just with some school projects, like I would be working and it just wouldn't be working, and then like, okay, let's throw this away, start
from
again. It looks beautiful
Yeah.
compared to the hash that I just threw away.
Yep.
It hurt, but it worked.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes it does hurt through it.
Right now, we're actually going through a system that has collected too much technical debt to really function
Mm-hmm.
well. We are having problems, and there's so much hacks all throughout it, we can't seem to troubleshoot the darn thing. And we are now facing the decision of what do we do? Do we get this thing? Do we build something from scratch? What do we do so we can actually use this system? Because it's a ticketing system that most of the Wilkinson Center uses for their events.
Now, you're going to run into this situation in a different environment. You're going to come in and be asked to take over some piece of code. And after examination, you're going to decide it's easier to throw it away and rewrite it from scratch. I went through this, the first real time I can recall this, back fall of '88. I was living in Santa Cruz. I got a contract programming job at Apple. Apple had bought this multimedia package that they were using to create self-running demos for dealer stores and also tutorials for end users for the Macintosh, Mac SE. And they hired me basically because there were bugs in the code and because there were features they wanted to add. And there was this one routine, which I still almost see in my mind. Code was all in Pascal, and there was this one core routine that was about 17 pages long. It was one subroutine. Probably had 30 go-to statements in it. And they were jumping back and forth. They weren't even paired. They were like, you'd go a ways, and you'd jump down, you'd go up, and then you'd jump back into the middle of the section of code. And I spent about a week looking at this. And didn't have much, I don't recall us having much in the way of source code debugging tools, of being able to step through the source code itself at that time. So this was mostly being done by hand and looking at stuff. And finally, I said, forget this, and sat down. It took about another week, 2 weeks, and read the source code, basically executed it by hand, figured out what it was supposed to do, how it was supposed to do it, and then rewrote brand new code that was about 2 or 3 pages long. Did everything the original one did, but I did it without the bugs. And then I was able to just start dropping in the feature requests they had. So in the process of rewriting it, I basically cleaned up the bugs that were bothering them and was able to easily extend it. So there will be times that you're going to face the same thing. You're going to take over a piece of code and you're basically going to look at it, whether it's your old code or particularly someone else's code, where it may be easier just to throw it away. Yes?
Is it sometimes easier to just clean up the current code, then rewrite it, and then run into the same walls that the previous people ran into?
Well, it's cleaning up the code. Now, I'm a big fan of cleaning up code. When I have to take over someone's code, which I've had to do any number of times in the past, I will often go through, reformat it according to my preferences, add documentation and so on, and in the process familiarize myself with it, and then if I have to fix bugs or add features, I know how it's actually supposed to work. The most dangerous thing is when you go in to either fix a bug or add a feature and you dive into this big pool of code and you do just that and then you climb back out of the pool. That's how code rots. You suffer from software entropy because you're doing things and you don't necessarily know what second and third order effects are going on because of what you just did. All you know is that you made the bug go away, or you put the nifty icon on the screen. And when you have a number of people doing this, the code can quickly become unmanageable and almost unreadable. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I want to be sure. Any other thoughts or questions on this before we move on? That's it. In the same chapter, he talks about planning the organization for change. And by the way, Brooks tends to deal with a lot of topics in each chapter that don't necessarily seem to be related to each other. I think it's because the publisher wouldn't let him have little tiny chapters. He touches briefly on an issue that we'll get into more in future chapters. And this is how many organizations, particularly corporations, don't have a technical career path. It's like junior developer, developer, senior developer, and then they push into management. Now, how many of you actually really want to be a manager or vice president? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. Being a good team leader is important, and I've been that. In fact, you know, it's been a couple decades since I've programmed for a living. But a lot of people don't want to be forced into management. And as a result, remember we already talked about the Dead Sea effect, didn't we? Yeah. This often is a cause for the Dead Sea effect. You have your best developers who just want to keep doing technical stuff. They're great at what they do. And management says, oh no, you have to stop programming. We need to make you a manager. And it's like, well, I don't want to manage. I said, well, okay, well, you don't get a raise then. Your professional progress is stunted. There are organizations that do in fact have good technical tracks, either by simply having a generic title for everyone, member of technical staff, and you get salary and salary bumps and perks and so on based on your seniority, performance, and so on. Or they have an actual technical track above senior developer. In theory, one that leads at least in the direction of becoming an architect and or CTO. Chief Technical Officer. We talked already something about the maintenance issue. About 2/3 of maintenance work is actually adding new features. And if you don't have someone who understands the architecture of the core system, in other words, if it's a legacy system and you're a new hire and they say, hey, here's this legacy system, we use it for payroll, we need you to add X. Typically, they won't want to give you the time to say, well, I actually need to understand the whole architecture before I make any changes because it's going to impact other things in the code. They're like, no, this should take a week. Just change this part to do X. And as I said, you do that often enough to source code, and the source code just becomes unstable and almost illegible. There are lots of legacy systems out there, and I dare say most of you will at one time or another find yourselves dealing with a legacy system that you really don't want to deal with. A lot of you have already from what you've said. Anyone want to share any particular horror stories about having to maintain an existing system? Where someone says, yes, go in and change this and put this in here, and you find it's much harder than you thought. Yes?
In my work, there's a website that we use to it's like managing just renting of bikes and canoes, all kinds of outdoors things, right? And they, I guess, to get some particular functionality, it's built on WordPress, but there's edits have been made to the core code that have to be maintained. So there's documentation that I had to write so that for every time we update the site, I have to go manually change the core code in the same way every time. And I'm like the guy who knows how to build the system. You're
the truck factor of one. Something happens to you and they'll have to pull someone else in and he or she'll have to learn the whole thing from scratch.
Yeah, that's painful.
Yeah. Any other stories anyone want to share? This is something you're probably, you may not, but I've had such a varied career that I've just had to do all sorts of stuff. Quality of time permits. This is from Peopleware. As I've already said, quality gets the short end of the stick. Most management has a very hard time understanding how much time it takes to do proper testing and the resources that should be devoted to it. And as Brooks pointed out, you know, he says, people object when I say that 50% of your schedule should be devoted to testing. He says most do not devote that much, but that's how much it ends up taking, which is why you have these projects that get 80% done and then drag on for months. What they're really doing is they're finally doing the testing and quality assurance they should have been doing all along. How do you feel? I mean, let me ask you this. How do you feel when you release code that you know is well done and that you've tested to a fare thee well and really happy about it? And how do you feel when you release code that you know is crap? I mean, how many have done both? Yeah. What are your feelings between the two? What's it like to release code that you're just like, yes, yes, we got this nailed? How's that feel? Someone? Anyone? Great. Great. Anyone else want to volunteer? Everyone's like, yeah, great. Okay, how's it feel when you release crap? Yeah.
This was open source and employers can see this on my GitHub profile now.
Oh. It's like, yeah, they're going to look that up and say, what the hell was he doing there? You feel bad. You push stuff out that's not ready, and it's kind of like, hey, this is wretched. Yes.
I feel like when I release stuff that is good, I start like volunteering other uses for it. Like it's like, oh, you can do this or you can do this. Or if I release stuff that's bad, I have to like make sure everyone knows. Oh, this is beta.
Don't use this. Don't use this for anything important. Don't use this if you don't mind. You know, only use this if you're reconciled to losing data.
Yes.
Something like that. Yes.
I feel like also this is a reason why a lot of people get disillusioned with like classes in school because they focus on quantity. They just have a bunch of projects you have to do, and you're just like pushing out crap code just to get it done, and you don't feel good about it. You're like, I'm a horrible programmer.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. I haven't looked lately at the curriculum here for the department and so on. I assume they have at least one class on software quality assurance. No?
There's like a verification validation.
Yeah, but that tends to be more theoretical and academic than. I think a true software engineering emphasis should have at least an entire semester devoted just to learning how to produce quality code. And giving you that opportunity. And say, okay, we're starting with this. Okay, now here's a new set of constraints. You know, how are you going to test it? How are you going to ensure it can do this? Okay, now we have to use 100 times the user base. How are you going to change it to make sure it can accept that? And just take that step by step and doing the various range of tests. We're going to talk a bit, briefly about that later on. Yes.
With the new software engineering emphasis, they do have a class CS329 on testing and validation.
Okay.
Is it required?
For the software engineering emphasis, it is.
Okay.
I actually should look into that and see what they require and how they run. Okay. Now this is a chapter that actually should have been delayed a little because it goes with Brooks' No Silver Bullet chapter. But I'm just as happy to introduce it here. The software industry is full of false hope. Brooks' essay, No Silver Bullet, Essence and Accident in Software Complexity, is the classic work on it. And the truth is, and we're back to ARMA, the truth is there are some things about software that are irreducibly complex. That's the essential complexity. Accidental complexity is your key programmer gets hit by a truck. Essential complexity is you're trying to do something that no one knows how to do, or that you're trying to support, 10 times the number of users anyone has supported before. Or if you're in game programming, you're trying to get, 4K with, 50 FPS and, you know, on a tablet or something, you know. So you have this, there's some new trick that can send productivity soaring. The claims that managers are getting these great gains. Software engineering by management is really dangerous. Managers will read an article in a magazine. I wrote a book called Pitfalls of Object-Oriented Development. And I am an absolute fan of object-oriented development. But I wrote this 20 years ago because object-oriented development was being horribly overhyped and oversold. You know, programmers can program 10 times faster. You don't have to do quality assurance with object-oriented development. It's like, are you insane? Yeah. And the idea that suddenly changing languages or methodologies will give you huge productivity gains. The idea that you're going to automate away your developers. Your people will work better if you put them under a lot of pressure. How many of you work with what you consider to be undue pressure from managers? Oh, not many of you. Well, you're good. Yeah, way to get out in the real world. We're back to, speaking of Dilbert, the Dilbert cartoon that I quoted a few weeks ago, where the pointy-haired boss asked Dilbert, how long is this project going to take? He says 3 days. He says, then I want it done in 2 days. And Dilbert says, I just told you it's going to take 3 days. Pointy-haired boss says, management, I'm being a manager. I'm getting higher productivity. And right now we're back to, I'm pretty sure I've already quoted the maxim. If I haven't, this is probably the first time you'll hear it and you may not like it. The only way to change an organization is to go in every day prepared to be fired. And if you're not prepared to be fired, then you're going to have to live with what the organization is doing.
Just make sure you're the truck factor when you do that.
Yes, make sure you're the truck factor when you do that. And realize that you may actually be fired. You know, it's like, oh, I'm taking a stand here, I'm saying this. It's like, okay, you know, we're going to escort you out the door and we'll send someone to clean out your desk and give you a box. Which leads me to a maxim that I have told all of our children while they've been growing up and had to remind them a few times as adults. In fact, I have one son right now, I keep trying to remind this of him, which is never quit a job until you have another job lined up. However unhappy you may be at your job, line up another job first. There is an inherent bias, particularly in the technology industry, against people who are unemployed. If you're unemployed, there's such demand. If you're unemployed, it's like, what's wrong with you? Obviously, you can't find a job, therefore there must be some wrong. There are actual companies that literally will not consider resumes of people who are currently employed or currently unemployed. They'll simply screen that out. Unless you have a current job, they just won't look at your resume. So yes, they will put you under pressure. You have to learn how to deal with that. And it can happen even with people you respect. We had problems with this at Pages during that whole year that we were late. The CEO and CFO kept trying to come up with things to motivate the engineers. You know, we're working 70 hours a week. It's like we don't need motivation. We're all risking burning ourselves out on this. And they came up with something new that they floated. And my sister, who was one of our senior software engineers, stopped me in the hall because she had heard rumblings of what they were doing. It was sort of a carrot and stick approach. You know, here are the benefits if we ship by such a date, and here are the penalties if we don't ship by such a date. We're the engineers. You know, we've all been working our butts off for a couple of years at this point. My sister Deirdre took me aside and said, don't they realize you're dealing with grown-ups? Often management doesn't realize you're dealing with grown-ups. They think of you all as recalcitrant children. You just need a firm hand and a lot of pressure and some threats of timeout if you don't do what they want you to do. I hope you don't end up with a place like that, but just don't be surprised if you do. Any observations, feedback, experiences? Yes. Yeah, went up there real quick.
I just had a comment on the changing languages. I was talking to my team lead today, and he said we just built an entire system in Scala. He said we're gonna rewrite it all in Go because that'll solve all of our bugs and problems. And I was like,
and what's the level of Go experience among your developers?
not much.
This is such a common mistake. First, believing that changing languages. What's one of the single most popular most widely used programming languages right now? C. C. C has been around for what, 40 years? Maybe 50? I was writing books on C compilers back in the 80s, 30 years ago. Guess how many, guess what is still, not in terms of new code being written, but in terms of lines of code operating? What's one of the major languages in the whole world? Fortran and COBOL. There's a couple billion lines of COBOL code in production. My whole experience with COBOL was as an undergrad, I picked up a book on COBOL, read it, and convinced myself I could teach myself COBOL if I ever had to. Unfortunately, never did. But there's a lot of code for COBOL out there. Okay, we talked some about, we actually already talked some of this. We talked about this table earlier, right? They threw it in one of my slides. If you've read this chapter, this is an important chapter because this is something you want to look for when you go out to interview. Now, it's not like you're going to say, are you a pathological management organization? That doesn't win you a lot of points. But you can look for things, and particularly, we'll talk about this more later, about questions you can ask, especially if you get a chance to talk one-on-one with other developers who are already there. And say, so how do they handle X? What's the response here when a project is late? Good answer is, well, we start reducing features. Bad answer is, well, everyone starts working weekends and nights. There's stuff you need to look for as far as how the organization functions and how effective it is. Okay, my readings. And again, I'm sort of wondering why I brought these up here. But hey, you'll read them too. They'll be useful for the midterm. You're going to have to read them at some time. How many have had to work on technologies that you know are already a dead end? Yes?
So I was working on converting a website to a mobile app. I was using this platform called Ionic. But I was right at the point where they were transitioning from their version 3 to version 4, which was fundamentally different at the architecture layout level. And so it was like this thing is like, all right, do I keep going this Ionic 3 version, or do I just kind of hope that this version 4 is going to come out in time? Kept getting delayed, so it's like,
oh, that is such a real world situation. It's kind of like I'm caught between releases, and it's a major change. Other experiences of working with technology that appears to be on the way out. How many of you have chased after Firefly technology? In other words, you've seen announcements about some nifty new technology, platform, language, or whatever, and you're waiting for it, and you're waiting for it, and you're waiting for it, and it never ships. Any of you had those experiences? Anyone can?
That's mostly, I've got one of my friends who does this all the time. You just have to be very careful to just like...
He's always chasing the...
If ever he tells us about some new thing that's going to come out, we have to wait till it actually comes out to actually be excited for it.
Yeah. There are a lot of companies that have looked at Firefly technology and said, oh, this is going to be great, we're just going to switch to this, and then it just sort of dies. Underdone. How many of you have used a 1.0? How many of you used a 1.0 release of some technology and wish you hadn't? Anyone? I certainly have. Yeah. What you got?
Yeah, the Arduino IDE. It still doesn't have autocomplete or like 80 features you'd expect from an IDE. That was the most disappointing thing I've ever done.
Which one was that?
Arduino IDE.
Oh, Arduino.
You'd be better off developing in Bin.
Yeah.
The first version of Angular.
Oh, first version of Angular. remember I told you the story about working at Eric where they were using ASN.1, which was A, obscure, 2B, no one had ever used it. They'd had a 2-week training period on it. And 3, they were using the 1.0 release of the development environment. I mean, that was like, you know, fireworks going off as far as red flags. It was like, this is going to be so ugly. And it was. It was a disaster. Conveyor belt, stuff that you're using and you know it's going to die. But you've just got to make it work until it actually falls off the other end of the conveyor belt. In other words, you're using a technology for whatever reason. And whether it's a hardware platform, whether it's a software platform or whatever, you'd be surprised how much of the world still runs on Windows XP. I sort of amuse myself. Yes.
From what I see, I kind of look at point of sale systems, old point of sale systems when I go shopping or when I'm at a mall or something. And basically, any point of sale system that is not on the square, like with the iPad or the tablet, every point of sale system that I've ever seen is on Windows XP.
But that's exactly what I do. I amuse myself that anything that's running, you know, it's running on top of Windows and it's in a commercial setting. I always look around for screens where looking for a blue screen or where the application has closed down and it's just the operating system. It's like, yeah, it's XP. It's amazing how much of the world you won't. XP is, and we're going to talk about, well, the slide won't show. XP is underreported as far as desktop share because most XP is in dedicated systems that aren't browsing, and that's how you get desktop share typically. When you hear about desktop share of an OS, what they're usually measuring is they're collecting statistics from browsers. But if you have a system that's a point of sale, that's in the hospital, in a doctor's office, in a dentist's office, back room, accounting, and whatever, usually they're not doing browsing with it, and so it tends to get underreported. Landfill is great hype, but dead on arrival. One of the great examples of this, which is long before any of you were born, was back in the 80s. IBM came out with the first business personal computer that really made personal computers respectable, the IBM PC. But then they wanted to get into the home market, which Apple pretty much had, and you had Atari in there and Amiga and a few others. And so they came out with the IBM PC Junior, which was such a flop in the marketplace that IBM literally buried unsold units in landfill. It was underpowered. It had what's commonly called a chiclet keyboard. How many of you ever chewed chiclet gum? Just had this very cheap, loose keyboard, and it was an absolute disaster. Arc of engineering just gets back to maintenance. You have a system that goes to production. You are, actually, I have to point it goes into production. You continue to improve functionality and performance, reliability, and then at some point, it starts to decline. You have features that are being added without proper architectural and design diligence. The code becomes less and less stable. You're trying to add stuff beyond, we're back to trying to build 2 or 3 stories on top of a wooden foundation. So if you get into software maintenance, which is often an entry-level job, one of the things to consider is where is the software you're maintaining at. If it's at this end, your problems are going to be much greater because you're going to find as you try to add features or fix bugs, you're going to introduce new bugs. I mean, that happens in software anyway, but it happens especially when software starts to get older. Thoughts, experiences, observations, questions? Anyone? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, right in that chart or in this whatever this is called, this slide, it talks about how backwards compatibility is maintained, and in the reading, you talk about how it causes a lot of problems when they try and maintain backwards compatibility. So my question is, like, large and widely used, do you basically just have to have a way to push updates to people, or because like like the article that we read talked about how Microsoft has issues with that specifically because XP is still used. I still use 7 because I hate Windows 10.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm one of those. I'm one of those problem people as well. And so my question is like, what do you do to deal with that issue if you're a large company with a large user base?
It's very hard. In other words, it's a very real issue because you're basically dealing with your own success. And it actually leads into the next article. I'm very proud of making this prediction back in 1996. Basically saying 30 years from now, I think Windows may well be the dominant desktop operating system still. Now this is only a couple of years, this is like a year after Windows 95 came out. It's only a couple of years after Windows 3.1 came out. And the simple truth is, there's market share. That blue line at the top is Windows. This is over the last 10 years. It's still at about around 90%. Around 90% of desktops run Microsoft, some version of Microsoft Windows. I have no idea what this little orange peak there, it's labeled unknown. I think that's probably a data glitch in their gathering, but I don't know. It mirrors almost exactly the stuff in Windows. I think it was failing to recognize some version of Windows. Yeah.
Pink is Apple.
Yeah, pink is OS X, Linux is red, Chrome is green.
Could the yellow be Android?
It could be, but I would actually say, well, yeah, actually it could be Android. That peak may coincide with a push on, no, they've got Chrome. Chrome OS is green. There are some Android-based systems, I know from a case that I did. But this is just desktop, it's not mobile device. I mean, if it's mobile device, then it's pretty much
So
like
why is
this.
iOS on?
That's a good question.
Similar to Chrome OS, or
Is it?
No, iOS should be on an iPad or iPhone, so I'm not sure why they have iOS tracking there, other than the fact that they don't have much of anything for it. So I think that's a problem with their graph. But this is the issue. Software technology becomes entrenched. I don't know how many of you saw the article that's just been circulating over the last few days. The U.S. military has just finally moved its nuclear missile response systems off of 8-inch floppies.
Good for them.
Oh, a TK? That's a good, actually, yes, it's a TK problem. The question is, well, who is still manufacturing 8-inch floppies? I'm old enough to have actually used 8-inch floppies. But they were kind of obscure even when I was your age. 5 1/4 was far more common. But the FAA, a lot of the FAA still runs on 40-year-old Burroughs mainframes. The FAA has tried several times to modernize their technology. It's spent literally several $billion, and most of their modernization efforts have failed. I think they've been more successful some of the more recent ones. But it's surprising how technology can entrench. Now, Y2K was actually something of a godsend because a lot of organizations, both commercial and government, were able to trash systems that they've been unable to trash, saying we can't update it to Y2K, so we're just going to buy all new hardware. The problem is we had this massive tech collapse simultaneous. You had this enormous spending. In the US, it was probably about $100 billion in Y2K remediation. And that sort of peaked right at the start of the year 2000, and suddenly tech spending fell off a cliff because all these, both, again, corporations, small businesses, government organizations, had just blown through years of IT budget to upgrade and replace their systems. And then the tech market collapsed, or the stock market collapsed, because the dot-com bubble burst. So we had this recession that happened starting right around middle of 2000. That was both due to Y2K and due to the dot-com bubble. Someone had a question. Yes?
Can you like briefly explain what Y2K is?
Yeah.
Unless someone else knows this.
Here's Y2K. I'm a programmer in the 60s or 70s or 80s. And I want to do a date field. And so I do 6 digits, day, day, month, month, year, year.
Okay.
Now, what happens when I hit 2000? Is that number 2000 or is it 1900? And so the Y2K problem was simply saying we have to convert our systems all to 4-digit. Or there were any number of hacks, and they were hacks. You say Windows, if it's just 2 digits, if it's '50 to '99, then it's 1950 to 1999, and if it's 00 to 49, then it's 2000 to 2049. Windowing system, yeah, that's a hack because that only lasts until Windows closes.
I actually had a personal experience with this bug.
Oh!
So we had a little like educational game that I used to play, and Math Blasters. If anyone ever played Math Blasters, and I was playing it in 2001 or 2. Just kind of fun. And you get to the end, and it prints out the little certificate of completion, and it printed out whatever the date was of 1902 on my screen, and I look at it, and I was obviously young, so I didn't know what was going on, but I thought it was weird.
Now, the reason they did this, of course, was it saved you 2 bytes. And that used to be very important. If you're programming on systems that only run on 64K of memory, every 2 bytes you save in the date field is important. Fixing the problem, now there are 2 great myths about Y2K, and I got sucked directly into the middle of it. I went out to Fannie Mae. We'll take a break in a second, we're almost done. Went out to Fannie Mae as part of OSG to oversee about 25 developers there doing object-oriented development at Fannie Mae. About 4 months after I get out there, the vice president that I'm basically is my direct report at Fannie Mae, Carol Teasley, is given Y2K remediation responsibility for all of Fannie Mae. So she turns to me and says, Webster, you're getting involved in this too. And I spent the next few years neck deep in Y2K. 2 things I can tell you is the problem was real. Without the remediation, I can tell you right now, Fannie Mae, which basically manages all these mortgages and everything else, would have ground to a halt without their remediation. And they spent 2 years and about $10 million doing all the testing, did a great job. Carol is still probably the best boss I ever worked with. The other problem is that, so it was a real problem, but you had within the media the typical hype, anti-hype cycle. The world's going to end, or it's all a hoax. Well, it wasn't a hoax. The world wasn't going to end. The biggest surprise in all of this was that the rest of the world got fine. I mean, I was dealing with the U.S. government. I had meetings in the executive office building next to the White House. I testified before Congress 3 times on Y2K issues. Spoke at the Center for Strategic and International Studies a couple times. But the clue I had was I actually spoke at a Y2K conference in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon. This was like 98. And I was one of the speakers, and I basically said, here are some of the problems that can occur if you fail to remediate your systems. We're talking about power outages and data loss and stuff like that. And after the talk, the vice president of the Bank of Lebanon came up to me. And he said, I'm not sure what you're worried about. I said, we deal with that stuff every day. And what I failed to grasp, what he was basically telling me, is that throughout much of the rest of the world, you do not have the stability of infrastructure, be it electric, water, internet, and whatever, that we are used to in the US. And they already have adaptive systems. They know what to do if the power suddenly goes out, or if they suddenly lose their internet. They already have all the things in place, and most of the rest of the world got by fine, with one exception, in my opinion. Now, I don't have any proof of this, but in the year 1999 and into 2000, the price of oil went up basically tenfold. Oil was selling as cheaply as $10 a barrel in early 1999. And it was over $100 a barrel by early 2000. I have to go back and look at the figures to be sure. It was this enormous run-up. And my personal suspicion is that was due to unremediated, unfixed Y2K problems with various oil production and refining systems around the world. But yeah, I can talk about Y2K. Okay, let's see. We got one more slide here. Yada yada yada. I assume you read the article. Let's take a break till quarter after, and then we'll talk about doing your test plan, and then get you out of here.